Well, hello, and thanks for joining me. My name is Mike Alexander. I'm going to talk about the vegetation of Skokholm Island, the past, the present, with some speculation about the future. Now, my talk is based almost entirely on a high-resolution, low-level aerial photograph that was taken in 2021. The flight was paid for by the Friends of the Islands, and without their support, without their financial support, none of this would have happened. I've been around the islands for quite a while. I first visited Skoma, it was in 1963. I went there as a schoolboy. I didn't get to Skokholm until 1965, but it was 66 when I really got to know Skokholm. I spent the year there as the assistant warden. Something like a decade later, I became the warden of Skoma and spent 10 years on that island. My interest in botany was slow developing and perhaps a late developer in a sense. Um, it happened because I had an opportunity quite a long time ago now to work with and run training courses with Professor John Rodwell. John Rodwell is probably one of the most important botanists working in Britain and indeed Europe. Um, 15 years ago, I commissioned John to look at the vegetation of the Pembrokeshire Islands and to give us advice on their future management. Um, Everything he had to say so inspired me. I remember in particular him saying that we must learn to look at these islands through island eyes and not compare them with something that happens somewhere else on the mainland. That may seem an odd thing, but up to that point, most botanists who visit the islands were rather critical, saying they didn't measure up to the mainland, but John had a different view. Um, and that's where my interest and my passion, in a sense, that's when it began and has developed ever since. Um, I don't think I need to say anything else by way of introduction, so let's get into the main part of my talk. So here it is. This is what we're so excited about, at least what I'm so excited about, this wonderful high-resolution photograph. Um, we're going to use it mainly for surveillance. There's a difference between surveillance and monitoring. Monitoring, we ask very specific questions. The surveillance, we're looking broader, we're keeping our eyes off the ball as well as on the ball in a sense. And the wonder of it is that, of course, we can't predict the sort of questions that people will want to ask of this information in the future. So it's there. I'm going to interpret it. I'm going to use it as a basis for describing changes in the vegetation. But as I said, this can be interpreted endlessly in the future. As we zoom in, we can see more and more. Even closer, and there is so much detail at this level, we can clearly see the vegetation, and to the left you can see goldenrod. Here we are. The yellow obviously is the goldenrod areas. We don't really need to do that, if the truth be told, because we can see it, but it's far easier to visualize change. It's far easier to calculate area occupied if we digitize the image and create these polygons. I'm going to come back to vegetation mapping in a minute. I just wanted to give you a quick idea of how we use the information in the photograph. Here's a nice fresh new map of the island. The wonder of using this sort of photography is that there are all sorts of benefits. This map is actually more accurate than the Ordnance Survey map. It's digitized directly from the photograph. I spent hours and hours and hours doing it. The yellow is the area or the parts of the island that are covered in vegetation. Around the fringe, the pink, that's the rocky areas, and then the dark blue at the intertidal zone. And I've actually digitized all the rocks in, even almost down to the level of stones. These maps are amazingly useful because they allow you to locate yourself precisely on the island. Of course, the other bonus is that the Trust owns copyright to this, so we can do what we like with it. This isn't going to be a technical talk, but there's one thing I need to introduce before I move on, and that's factors. So anything which have are or could change the vegetation, influences if you like, they can be positive and negative, and they can be anthropogenic, something that people have done or are doing, or they can be natural. I'm going to use factors for the next few minutes of my talk. Whenever we try to understand vegetation, the pattern of vegetation, the composition of the various plant communities, we always need to consider the factors or the influences, those things that make it possible for that particular community to exist in that particular place at that time. This is one of the most significant factors, and it's so terribly obvious you may wonder why I'm showing you. Island biogeography. The principle is very simple. The smaller and more remote an island, the greater the chance of species extinction, and that certainly is the case. It means that islands generally have fewer species than the mainland, or small islands have fewer species than large islands, and all sorts of exciting, interesting things can happen as a consequence. Here's an example of what can happen as a consequence of isolation. This is a plant, wild pansy, very, very common on Skokholm, particularly on the neck. It doesn't occur on Skoma at all. It's as if the plants that actually get onto an island and thrive on an island is almost serendipitous. I rather like these things. I like the variety, the mixture of colours and so on. The next, and again very obvious factor, is climate. This is another obvious and major factor: wind speed, direction, and salt deposition. I bring them together because obviously it's the big gales that pick up the salt and transport it across the island. These together have an overwhelming impact on vegetation, and what it simply means is that the plants in the more exposed areas have to be extremely tolerant of wind and, more significantly, of salt deposition. This is a very poor photograph just to illustrate my point. This is bracken on Skokholm in May 2021, following that huge unseasonable storm that had such an impact on our seabirds. And you can see that the emergent fronds, dark brown, all entirely burnt out by the salting. The previous photograph was taken at the beginning of a week's stay, and this one was taken at the end. So just a few days later, bracken is recovering. It has amazing recovering properties. So you can see in this photograph the dark brown burnt out fronds, but then very rapidly, as in the course of a week, replaced by fresh green growth. But of course, each time this happens, the bracken is weakened. And if it happens too frequently, i.e. close to the cliff edges, then it's very obvious that bracken will not persist and can't survive, and other plants replace the bracken in those areas. Well, here another aspect of climate is rainfall and drought. I'll begin with drought, in fact. Increasingly, as time goes on, we seem to be having more and more frequent drought periods on the islands. And drought has quite a significant, or a very significant, effect on the vegetation. The obvious is that during dry summers particularly, we see the vegetation almost burning off on the cliff edges. At times this can be so severe that very large areas of bare ground are created. Going back in the past on Skoma, there was a huge drought back in the 70s where vast areas of vegetation burnt off, and one of the responses was in the following years a huge invasion of foxgloves. This is not uncommon. So drought has an impact, and drought, when severe, can actually change the structure of the vegetation quite significantly. Rainfall, and the problem seems to be these days that we're getting more violent episodes, more violent storm episodes, and it's difficult to assess the impact it's going to have. But for a long time, obviously, rainfall has impacted on the vegetation, in that some of the lower lying levels and some of the waterlogged areas on Skokholm are a consequence of rainfall. To understand the pattern of vegetation, it's probably best to try and look at the soils, the waterlogged soils, which I said are a consequence of periodic quite high rainfall. But we'll need to get a perspective on this. The islands of Pembroke Islands are some of the driest places in Wales. Unfortunately, I couldn't locate a soils map of Skokholm, but I used Mary Gillam's detailed vegetation map from 1948, digitized those communities which only exist on waterlogged soils, and the green areas are those areas, and that's as good as any map of the soils on Skokholm. Apart from the waterlogged areas, the remainder of the island is covered with more or less brown earths. But these waterlogged areas do have a very significant impact on the pattern of vegetation. Well, just to emphasise my point, this is North Pond on Skokholm, and this is a pond that was largely dug out. People dug it out. I had a hand in it in 1966, and the water level in the pond is very much represents the water level in the surrounding ground, and we can see the impact that waterlogging has. Yet another factor, this time the birds. Burrowing birds obviously have a very, very significant impact. Mary Gillam, I'll introduce her soon, she believed they had very significant impact on some of the communities. And of course guano, the enrichment, the soils on Skokholm are enriched, and that is very obvious from some of the plant communities. So past land use on Skokholm is hugely significant. People have been there for a very long time, and they've changed, they've modified the vegetation. I'm going to have to whiz through this section, so bear with me. Whenever we discuss or try and understand vegetation in a given location, and we're considering the impact of people, it's always worth thinking about what was there before. And some people would suggest that the name Skokholm is derived from the Old Norse, which meant wooded island. The probability, but not certainty, is that there were trees on Skokholm in the past. This is quite a good example of what it might have looked like. This is a place called Crybynnau, north of Porthgai in North Pembrokeshire. I was watching seals here one day down the beaches. I lifted my binoculars and looked at that ridge that you can see in the middle of the photograph, and I realized that I was looking at an oak canopy. So a fragment, a relic, an ancient oak wood. But the point is, the exposure here is not going to be terribly different to some parts of Skokholm, and yet woodland is able to survive. If it can survive here, then there is a probability that it could have survived on Skokholm. So people have influenced the vegetation on Skokholm from a very, very long time. The prehistory was poorly understood perhaps until this last year, 2021, when Richard and Giselle, whatever they were doing, they discovered in a rabbit burrow just in front of the buildings, first of all, a Mesolithic bevel pebble, 6,000 to 9,000 years old, and this is the first evidence of hunter-gatherers, Mesolithic, Middle Stone Age people on the island. And then they went on to discover a fragment of 3,000-year-old early Bronze Age vase or bit of pottery, and this is the first such find on any of the Pembroke grounds. So well done, Richard and Giselle. They've opened our eyes to what was going on in the past. So very briefly then, although we know that things were happening long before the 17th century, we begin to find written records, and in the 17th century we knew they were fattening sheep, cows, oxen and horses. 18th century, again written records, there was pasture supporting 8 cows, and there was enclosed arable land which was limed. You recall the lime kiln on the way up from the landing. The crops were oats and barley, the pastures were ryegrass and clover, and part of the island was used to provide peat for fuel. By the Victorian era, Vaughan Palmer Davies, who held a tenancy on Skokholm for over 30 years, he also leased Skokholm, mainly kept ponies there, but his main income was from trapping rabbits. I'll come to rabbits a little bit later on. 1927, Ronald Lockley took over the lease from Bulldog Edwards, who's always described as one of the last farmers. I think he was more of a rabbit catcher than anything else. And Ronald set to trying to make a living on the island in the early years. This is quite an interesting photograph from the 1930s. I can't date it precisely, but it was in a collection from the 30s, and it just illustrates how different the vegetation must have been. Look at that load of hay. It's pretty spectacular by any standard. We know that in 1938 there was a largish flock of sheep on the island. They were Clin Forest ewes, and you can see the two dark ones in the photograph. In fact, they're cross Clin Forest and Soay. 1948, a bit of trivia, the last cow was removed. 1951, post-war, there were a flock of 96 Soay sheep and a few goats and a pony. And then somewhere, I think it was 1977, the remaining goats were removed, and that was the end of grazing by domestic stock on the island. You may wonder why it's so important that we consider past grazing on Skokholm. And perhaps this is the best example I can think of. This is a deer park next to Skokholm, and over the years the vegetation has been completely transformed. If your memory is as long as mine, you'll remember huge areas dominated by bramble, rank vegetation, and then it's quite a few years ago, it's a couple of decades ago now, if not more, the National Trust put on some ponies in the first instance, and then for the last few years they've had up to a dozen cattle, and the impact that they've had is so significant, and you can see some quite exciting heath in the foreground. There was very little of that in the past, so very few animals can completely transform the vegetation. Rabbits, I could easily give you an entire 2-hour lecture on rabbits and then leave things unsaid. We know they were introduced to the island around 1180, brought to Britain by the Normans. They were a luxury food at that time, and warrens were set up to produce food for the nobility. The first record of rabbit farming on Skok was 1324, but that's the first record. Clearly it was going on before then. Vaughan Palmer Davies, who farmed Skokholm during the Victorian period, he also trapped rabbits on Skokholm, or he trapped rabbits on Skokholm, Skokholm and Midland, and the greater part of his income was derived from rabbit trapping. Ronald Lockley, in 1927, when he arrived, he first of all employed a rabbit trapper, and in that first year they caught 2,415 rabbits, which Ronald estimated to be 70% of the population. They stopped trapping with gin traps at this point because Ronald was dismayed by the number of birds that were accidentally trapped, but they did carry on trapping rabbits. He introduced chinchilla just as a means of raising an income, and hoped that these would perhaps replace the rabbits, but unfortunately he failed. In 1936-37 there was an attempt to introduce myxomatosis that failed, suggested because of the lack of fleas on the rabbits. In 1939-40 he set about exterminating the rabbits with cyanogas, but once again this was a failure. Rabbit harvesting ceased sometime in the 40s, don't know exactly when. Certainly by the 50s, with myxomatosis generally on the mainland, there was no appetite for rabbits, and so there was no market. So rabbits are incredibly important, obviously, because of the impact that they have on the island. And from a conservation management perspective, we need to think very carefully about how we regard these animals. They were introduced, as I've said, but many people call them wild, but what's in a name? we've seen from the past that it's virtually impossible to eradicate them, but what we realise, of course, if we think about it, is that the vegetation on Skokholm at the moment, which is mainly a consequence of rabbit impact, is very, very conducive to supporting the very large populations of seabirds on the island. There's obviously the suggestion that if it isn't broken, don't fix it, and certainly it's working well. So maybe we have to regard rabbits as sort of honorary natives and treat them as such. Dr. Mary Gillam, MBE, 1921-2013, a formidable lady. I met her a few times, quite a long time ago now. I just wish I'd spent more time talking to her. She did a PhD University of Wales, Bangor, 1949 to 1953, and her subject was the vegetation of the South Pembrokeshire Islands, and interestingly in relation to the environment. So where I've been using factors, she talked about relationship to the environment is much the same thing, and her thesis in fact examines the way in which the natural and anthropogenic factors have impacted or had impacted on the vegetation of Skokholm. She sets the scene. She provides in her thesis and in her publications a most incredible description of the vegetation on Skokholm in the 1950s. We really owe her a huge debt of gratitude. This is a digitized copy of the map that Mary published in 1954. It's a crude sketch map in many ways, but it is so very informative. Well, I was always satisfied with Mary Gillam's published map, but a couple of years ago, Richard and Giselle were looking around in various documents and they came across this. It's quite an incredible find. Now this is a map that it looks as though it dates from 1948, just preceding Mary's period doing her PhD, but this I think was probably put together by a group of students from Swansea, and I think Mary Gillam was with them. The handwriting I think is Mary Gillam's, but what an incredible find, this amazingly detailed map, far more detailed than the published map. I spent seemingly forever digitizing Mary's map, and even then I couldn't capture the level of detail that she'd used. But what a treasure, what an incredibly important document. This is a fabulous record of what the vegetation, the patterns of the vegetation were like in 1948, and this is going to be the reference point that I'm going to use throughout this talk. Well, so to begin with, the one community that has probably changed least of all on Skokholm, this is the Maritime Cliff and Crevice community. The species, and indeed the species composition that we're familiar with today, I would guess that Mesolithic people would have seen something very, very similar. Unchanged because it's a natural community where people have very, very little impact of any kind. It's the community shown in pink around the edges of the coast, occasionally on the very big, it occurs on the very big, very large inland rocks. So this is what it looks like. This is this very exciting cliff or crevice community. Named after two species, rock samphire and rock sea sparrow. Rock sea sparrow, quite rare on Skoma, there's bits and pieces around the place, but much more frequent on Skokholm. It's the lovely little pink flower on the left. And then on the right, a plant which is much scarcer on both islands. You can spend a while on the islands and not ever see it. That's the rock samphire. Diminutive member of the umbelliferae, related to cow parsley and angelica and things like that. And then the other photograph shows thrift, and that's the one plant that is most familiar in these areas. So a very beautiful and very special plant community. So here's a very big statement for you. Change is an inevitable consequence of life. We have Darwin to thank for our understanding of change. I can't describe all the changes that have taken place in the vegetation. We'd be here for several weeks, but so I'm just going to focus on some of the most obvious changes, the key changes. One of the most obvious and startling is the change in the distribution of thrift. This is Mary Gillam's 1948 map, and you can see that there are significant areas, very significant areas of thrift right around the coast. This is 1989. It's still abundant, but you can see quite clearly that it's beginning to decline. Note in particular the neck on the right hand side. You can see that it's almost absent. Now, we're not talking about the occurrence of just a few scattered individual plants. These are areas of vegetation which are completely dominated by thrift. And then the aerial photograph, which gives us a slightly different complexion, and you can see that it is now restricted to the north and west, and very little apart from scattered plants elsewhere. So an amazing change, an amazing loss. By the way, there's something I want to illustrate here. If you look at the 1948 map, and I hope you can see my cursor, you'll notice that the vegetation, the outline of the thrift, actually goes out to sea, out into the, certainly into the intertidal zone. And the point I'm making is that never mind how careful people were in the past, all they were able to do when mapping vegetation was produce sketch maps. And they were quite inaccurate. It would be virtually a waste of time to try and use this map to accurately describe the distribution. It gives us a picture, but it is not accurate, and certainly not one that we could use to quantify the area covered by thrift in 1948. It seems that the 1989 map is even less accurate than Mary Gillam's, which I guess is predictable. She did spend quite a lot of time and was a meticulous mapper. The big difference, of course, is that the 2021 version is incredibly accurate and based on the aerial photograph. When we try to understand the vegetation of a place, it's always worth looking at the same plant community in different places. So this is the deer park looking towards Skokholm, and precisely the vegetation that Mary Gillam mapped in pink. You can see here that the sward is dominated by fescues, by grasses, with clumps of thrift and other plants. So it's much more diverse. If we look closely, and this again is from the deer park, we find that it's quite a rich, quite a diverse community with thrift, red fescue, sea campion, bird's foot trefoil, kidney vetch, sea carrot, common scurvy grass, buckthorn plantain, sheep sorrel. I think I'll stop there, but there's a lot of species that I haven't even named. So a very diverse community, but this is the consequence of grazing by domestic animals. Possibly a few rabbits in there as well, but this is the consequence mainly of grazing by domestic animals. If we remove the animals completely, then this happens. It becomes significantly more boring. Red fescue, which is so very palatable to animals, dominates, and the thrift just exists in clumps. And in a sense, I think we'd look at this thrift and say this is a survivor of an earlier time, not something which has got into the community recently. And if we look at the extreme, if we look at sites that are ungrazed, then this happens. Red fescue becomes completely dominant. I never forget staying on North Bishop years and years ago, staying overnight on North Bishop, sleeping on a mattress of pure red fescue with virtually nothing else. The only places where we saw other plants were on the rocky faces, the rocky crevices and so on. So this is no grazing or incredibly light grazing. But if we graze, and we graze heavily, and particularly if we graze with rabbits, not sheep and cattle, this happens. And this is a photograph taken on Skokholm a few years ago. This is what Mary Gillam would have found virtually that's wide band right around the coast. And all that's happened here is that most of the other plants, excepting perhaps a little bit of sea campion here and there, have been grazed away by the rabbits. So they've given the thrift an incredible advantage, and it completely dominated the scene. So the story then would be vegetation that look perhaps closer to what I showed you on the deer park, and then without doubt a period of agricultural abandonment, increasing rabbit population, and we can understand how the thrift became dominant. But what's more complicated is its demise. Mary Gillam had some pretty good ideas, but I'm not absolutely certain that she was right. But this now is a picture of a similar place on Skok, and you can see quite clearly that this area, which was once a solid mat of thrift, how thrift is dying back, and the sea campion is beginning to dominate. So this is Mary Gillam's theory. What she's suggesting, and these wonderful drawings, what she's suggesting is that the hummocks, the thrift hummocks, become moribund simply because of the attention, or the undesirable attention, of burrowing rabbits, burrowing birds. And the sequence of drawings you can see, the aeration, the desiccation leads to the loss of thrift. The only problem is that I know of many areas where precisely the same thing has happened, where there are virtually no burrows. So it's possible that the burrows speed up the process, but I think there's rather more to it than simply burrows. So whatever the reason, I simply wonder whether as a species growing in that form, that is solid mats of it, and whether it's simply doomed to failure. But whatever the reason, this is what replaces it, and I'll show you in a second the maps. So you can see here distribution of sea campion, just little bits, little patches, just above the lighthouse, odd little bits, little bit right out on the neck, but very little. So this is 1948 Mary Gillam's map, and then if we go to the 2021 map, and you can see, wow. So all the areas that were originally occupied by thrift are now occupied by sea campion, an amazing growth. And if I go to the next photograph, and here I've put both together so you can see it. So we've got Mary Gillam's 1948 distribution of thrift, and today this amazing distribution of sea campion. Sea campion is remarkably salt tolerant, more so in fact than thrift. I don't have a clear understanding of precisely why this change has taken place. It certainly needs a lot more attention. But whatever the reason, I think it's quite beautiful. I quite enjoy these areas, and you know, in hot summer days when everything's very still, the sort of honey smell that comes off this is quite lovely. And so to bracken. Now earlier I showed you the impact that salt and wind had on bracken, and here you can clearly see the distribution. It's growing in the sheltered areas. The more exposed northwest coasts, it's quite impossible for bracken to survive. It's important when we're looking at this photograph from 1948 that we understand that the bracken distribution is increasing, or has increased significantly by this time. I think if we'd visited the island in the 1880s when Vaughan Palmer Davis was active, we'd have seen significantly less. So as agriculture declined, bracken increased. And if I leap to 2021, you can see very clearly that actually the pattern, the distribution hasn't changed. It's as if the spaces have been filled in. I would guess at the moment, looking at the vegetation on Skokholm, that bracken has probably reached some sort of peak. I don't predict any further increases. So what I've done here is very simply just to make the point. I've placed the 1948 image in pale green on top of the dark green of the 2021 image, and you can see the pattern. The pattern is more or less the same. One of the other species that I was able to map in 2021 was the bluebells, and by placing the bluebell map on top of the bracken map, we can clearly see how the bluebells are by and large dependent on the bracken. They use the opportunity, the niche, if you like, early in the spring before the fronds open. There's plenty of light, bluebells can flower, and then for the rest of the year the bracken fronds maintain moist, humid conditions which bluebells need, and that's exactly what happens in a woodland canopy. So this association is quite useful. Next time you're on either of the islands in August, when the place is dominated by bracken, don't curse the bracken, just think about what it was like earlier in the spring. Just two maps quickly to illustrate the restricted areas or areas where bracken can't grow. Very much a similar pattern on both islands. On Skokholm, because it's more exposed than Skoma, there is much less bracken, but the distribution is restricted in exactly the same way on both islands by salt-laden winds. There's probably some way to go for the bracken on Skoma, despite the crop that you can see now. The central fields, it's only a matter of time, I think, before they fill in. On Skoma, you can distinctly see North Valley and South Valley, quite large areas in the middle which are devoid of bracken. That is waterlogging. The same thing on Skokholm to around the pond, and then further towards the south. There's an area there of waterlogged soil that I showed you earlier on, and that's another factor that inhibits bracken. So here's the next community I want to talk about, the heathland community. It's a community. It was mainly dominated by heather, Kaluna. This is Mary Gillam's 1948 map, and you can see that there were reasonably extensive areas of heather. I remember it in the 1960s, mid-60s, if you walked from the Bird Observatory to North Pond, you walked through heather. It was rather nice. There were substantial areas there, and it wasn't terribly different to Mary Gillam's map, although that is, the distribution wasn't very different, but the extent obviously had reduced. But by now, Heath as a community on Skokholm is extinct. Which is that's pretty sad in a sense. I think it's important to reflect on the fact that heath, the sort of heaths that we find on that were found on Skokholm, were largely the consequence of agriculture, of human activity, and in particular agriculture. We'll just pop up to Ramsey in the north, give us a bit of a picture of what both Skokholm and indeed Skoma, I think large areas of both islands would have looked like this at one time. It's a restricted heath. There are other species that you would expect on the mainland, but as I mentioned earlier on, islands have fewer species, so it's quite a good picture of what might have been. The one that is most likely is this one. It's slightly different. The heaths that I showed you earlier on, as I said, were a consequence of agricultural activity and particular grazing. But this one is a heath that exists in very extreme conditions, where the vegetation that would naturally compete with the heather is suppressed by wind and salt. And this is a lovely example from the deer park, right on the end of the deer park. And it's a vernal squill or spring squill heath community, and on Skokholm, and this is all that remains of that community on Skokholm. Just occasional small patches. The vernal squill, the blue, is still there. There's a tiny bit of very close cropped fescue, so different. This is the last relic, if you like, of the heaths on Skokholm. Now for something a little bit different. This is goldenrod. Now, earlier I talked about using the aerial photograph as a means of surveillance, that is, repeating the photographs over time. Here we're using the same information but monitoring. The presence of goldenrod on Skokholm is slightly contentious. So mapping goldenrod, well, Mary Gillam unfortunately didn't map it in 1955. She made this statement, it's abundant among the more sheltered bracken stands of the east, and she's meaning east of the observatory buildings. By 1989, we have the first reliable sketch map. Distribution is much as Mary described it. It's slightly to the east of the observatory. By 2007, you can see the pattern is slightly different, well, significantly different. In fact, it's moved much further west and indeed much more towards the neck. 2014 was quite a year for goldenrod by the looks of it. You'll see some photographs in a minute taken in that year, very extensive cover. I think it's important we reflect on the fact that the distribution of goldenrod does vary very significantly from year to year. So by 2021, there would appear to be much less than 2014. Again, the pattern, the distribution is very similar, but there have been significant losses this time to the east of the track from the haven up to the lighthouse. Again, this is the maps are telling us that goldenrod is in fact quite dynamic, and that it may occupy a space for a period and then move on. I don't think there's a great deal to be concerned about when a goldenrod is occupying the central fields. Indeed, some have put forward the argument that the presence of goldenrod creates structural diversity, allows other plants that are more palatable to rabbits to gain some sort of advantage, and is probably good for invertebrates. I guess we should be a little bit concerned when it gets into the cliff and crevice communities where it can replace the native flora. This is, as you can see, taken in 2014, quite a year for goldenrod, and it would have been easy to come to perhaps the wrong conclusion that year and think that it was beginning to swamp the island. But certainly by 2021, the cover had reduced significantly. We now, of course, I talked about monitoring earlier on. We can set a limit if we want, if we feel it's necessary for goldenrod. We could, for example, say we're happy enough with it in the open ground, but we don't want to see it on the cliffs. And I guess if we had the energy and the time, it would be possible to control it in these limited areas. It seems to me, though, that we're in a watching game. We don't need to make a decision overnight. We will set our monitoring in place and we'll watch it. We'll take hopefully a sequence of these photographs every few years or so, and we'll gain a better picture as to what's really happening. So now I come to the future. The title of my talk, you may recall, was Skokholm Vegetation, Past, Present and Future. The past was wonderfully described by Mary Gillam in the early 50s. The present, we have a superb recording thanks to the aerial photograph. But I should have mentioned earlier on, the aerial photographs are supplemented by decade on decade of detailed recording of fixed quadrats around the island, and that information gives us a far more detailed understanding of the changes. The aerial, in fact, makes it slightly easier for us to interpret the changes because we can see it in the spatial context. That it is important that I don't give you the impression that we rely entirely on maps and aerial photographs to describe the vegetation, to understand the vegetation. But what of the future? Well, the one thing that's pretty obvious is that it's going to change. It's going to continue to change. In a sense, and this is a very strange word to use, it is recovering from past agriculture. Now, very intensive for a long period, and then tailing off. Perhaps Vaughan Palmer Davis was the last person to make any real money out of it. The rabbit farming that went on, suppressing the rabbits, and then Donald Lockley with a few cattle, lots of sheep, trying chinchillas, all sorts of things. All of these had an impact on the vegetation. In some ways they suppressed it, in other ways they gave certain species an advantage. And of course all of that has changed, and changed since the 1970s, when the last grazing animals, that is the goats, were taken off the island. The sort of change that we're seeing that starts from that point, if you like, will continue and continue into the future. And it's not entirely predictable. I don't think there'll be any massive changes. Perhaps a redistribution here and there, perhaps a loss of a species here or there. It's very, very difficult to tell. So how do we deal with this? The Wildlife Trust has a responsibility for the management of the island. And of course our prime concern are the seabirds. So we've got to think about what we would find acceptable in the future. Nature conservation management requires us to make decisions about the future, decisions about what we want. I used the word incautiously earlier on, and that was recovering, when I suggested vegetation was recovering from a prior state. That somehow suggests possibly that we're going backwards, that we want to go back to something that happened in the past. Tomorrow will be different to anything that ever existed in the past. That we can be sure of. The factors that are going to influence the vegetation, the starting point, and so on. So something very different is going to happen. Now, at the moment, we are very happy with the condition of the vegetation, in that it is certainly conducive to maintaining the very large populations of particularly puffins and shearwaters. It suits them, and they are our prime concern. And so whatever happens, whatever the future may be, we must continue to safeguard those species. But otherwise, we can perhaps relax and allow the vegetation or nature to do what she wants with the vegetation. Again, it's difficult to see how it could become problematic. I guess we have the experience of Skokholm, where we are worried about the increase in, or potential for an increase in, bramble, which could have an impact on perhaps the shearwaters. We don't know. But nevertheless, our objective is to enable the natural development of all the plant communities, insofar as any change is compatible with maintaining optimal conditions for the breeding seabird populations and all other legally protected features. Now, this is an objective for discussion. It's not finalized. Our plan isn't finished, and there'll be some additional thought put into that. But it reflects a position which, if we're totally honest about it, doesn't allow us much flexibility. There's not much we could do to manage the vegetation on the island. I talked about getting rid of rabbits and made the point that it's virtually impossible and probably highly undesirable. We can't reintroduce grazing animals, as an example. In fact, there's very little that we can do. So it's perhaps, if nothing else, a very pragmatic objective. Well, there we are. I've dealt with past, present, future as best that I can. Future, you know, these days we have to understand that our ability to predict is seriously obscured by the clouds of climate change. It would be folly to try and think too far into the future, because we really don't know what's likely to happen. Well, there we are. I've come to the end of my talk, and I really must finish with a very, very big thank you to the friends of Skokholm and Skoma. It really was incredibly generous of them to finance this. And I can't overemphasize how important this sort of surveillance is. It gives us so much more security. It allows us to make, I hope, appropriate decisions. So we're very, very grateful. Because I really have to thank two very important people, Richard and Giselle, who have made it possible for this work to go on, who over the last few years have helped me in so many different ways. Above all, they have made me feel so very welcome and at home on the island, and for that I am extremely grateful. Well, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Thought I'd better put a couple of bird photographs in. I've gone a whole talk on Skok without birds, so we'll end with a couple of birds. So thank you. Bye bye.